Hey everybody, this is Professor Diaz-Kozlowski, and this is the Significance of Feminism mini lecture. And it's going to focus on two pieces from Unit 2, which is the historical and contemporary evolution of U.S. intersectional feminisms. And so I'm going to focus on Bell Hook's essay, Feminist Politics, Where We Stand, to help articulate to you why feminism is inherently a political project. And then also, we're going to discuss Amanda Marcote's essay, A Short History of Feminists, Anti-Feminists, the Early Sisters of Sarah Palin, and go over the three phases to anti-feminism and these outcomes to anti-feminism. And then also, at the end, the conclusion, we'll talk about what does feminism do, and inherently why should people advocate feminism and the relationship between anti-feminism and feminism within patriarchy. So I'm not going to go over these big terms again, but I wanted to include them because I want you again to continue to realize how patriarchy, sexism, and feminism are interrelated. Specifically, how feminism is trying to dismantle patriarchy and that sexism is a piece of patriarchy. And again, the patriarchy is a socio-political system. It is not an individual bad man hiding in the bushes. And that sexism itself also, right, is a system. And that's really important to think about as we move through this course. Sexism is a system and an ideology that exists, okay? It exists to justify social relations as they are patriarchal. So feminism is important because it's trying to, collectively, we are trying to end the sexist oppression. So for folks, when they talk about the first wave of feminism, they're talking about the suffrage movement, and that was happening in the 18th and 19th century, right? That was happening before 1848, but it wasn't until 1848 that there was this large convention. Particularly wealthy white women who were married or widowed came together in Seneca Falls. They created this ongoing plan of how women were going to be able to vote in the United States, and that finally happened on August 18th, 1920. So it took more than 70 years, but a collective 70 years of advocating for women to have the right to vote. So I have here that politics is, again, a very important institution. Now, when the 19th Amendment was passed, it legally enfranchised all women to vote, but women of color were actively prevented from voting by white people, both white women and white men, particularly those who worked as state and local officials. And this was a part of the backlash to the 19th Amendment, but it was also a part of Jim Crow, right? And so after the Civil War, Jim Crow began as a way for this, again, relationship between white people and black people to be unequal, for us to sort of be together. But often people aren't told or taught the way that race, class, and gender are always intermixed with one another, and particularly black women are erased from the suffrage movement, which is really important for you to understand that yes, the 19th Amendment legally enfranchised all women to vote, but women of color were actively prevented from voting, and why they were prevented from voting. So it wasn't until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, actually, that women of color were finally be able to vote, because the 1965 Voting Rights Act eliminated these literacy tests and poll taxes that were placed on black people, particularly in the South, that prevented them from voting, right? And the other important thing to remember is that the 19th Amendment is the most significant outcome of the first wave of feminism. That's really important. You need to know that, taking this course. And the other key piece is you should know what the 19th Amendment states. That is an important thing for all of you as potential college graduates. So I have here that it says you can't deny a citizen, that's another key word, of the United States the right to vote based on sex. So it isn't until the second and third wave of feminism that we begin to understand that actually gender is a social construction. And so it's very important to understand that the 19th Amendment does not say gender, it says sex, and what the implications of that are. So if we shift gears here and continue on to the second and third wave of feminism, Bell Hook's piece really helps sort of clarify that the 19th Amendment was important and that we needed that outcome, but that it wasn't enough, and that feminism is inherently a political project because it is trying to dismantle sexism. So as she states in the essay, sexism is the problem, not feminism or feminists, right? And she's also articulating in interrogating two powerful dominant institutions, mass media and Christian culture. And she's articulating how these institutions work to reinforce the myths of feminism, right? And to discredit and to blame women for challenging patriarchy, essentially. And so what often happens and why this is significant is because the media is really important, and that's a dominant way that people get their information. And so the general public is learning what feminism is from this patriarchal mass media and their myths about feminism, and they're very pervasive. So often what happens is students who take this course, once they get to the course and they begin to learn these things, they realize that they have to unlearn a lot, and they have to unlearn these myths of feminism because you were taught these growing up. So here you are, and you have all of the myths here on the right, of what these myths of feminism are. And again, they're myths, so that means that they are not true, right? We know that feminism is the collective struggle to end sexist oppression, and that sexism is the problem. Women are not the problem. Feminism is not the problem. Sexism is the issue. And so what Bell Hooks is trying to tell you in this piece are some really, really important things. Number one, that as women, we are taught that we should be subordinate to men. And we're taught that, and it's reinforced in institutions, and it's also reinforced symbolically. So what does that mean? Why is that significant? Well, that's significant because as women, we internalize this. And so in order to not have that, we have to unlearn it. And you don't just unlearn it and then like your life gets better. You have to continually unlearn it throughout your entire life. So that's really significant. And the other really important thing is that women internalize sexism to try and access this patriarchal power temporarily, whether that's consciously or unconsciously, right? So that's something that I want you to kind of think about as we move through and get to Amanda Marcote's piece. And so in Sean Lee, you learned about the different approaches to feminism, and that's because there's not one way to dismantle patriarchy. We need multiple strategies to dismantle this monster, if you will, right? And the other thing I want to say about feminism and sexism that Bell Hooks, she kind of touches on, but she doesn't get into it too specifically, is that there's this fear, real fear that's associated with being perceived as a lesbian, and that all feminists are lesbians, because to identify as a lesbian is used as a threat. It's used as a threat to keep women subordinated, apart from one another, and it contributes to sexism and misogyny because lesbian identities are stigmatized. So heterosexual women who have these biases and discriminate against lesbians, this is a result. This is an outcome of this sexism and homophobia that they internalize. And so it's used as a threat. So it's not a bad thing to be a lesbian. But it's important to understand the way that that's used as we talk about who is a feminist and who wants to be a feminist. No, not all feminists are lesbians, but it's okay if you are a lesbian. But this word is used as a negative, and it's not just, oh, you're different because you're a lesbian. It's you're seen as inferior, that you're not really a real woman. So keep that in mind as we continue to move through the course and think about the way that language and identities are interconnected in the way that they parse people, and the way that different identities in dominant groups and subordinate groups have relations with one another. So her last, conclusions in the essay, she's telling us that we need feminism and we need these multiple approaches because we want to dismantle systems of power. We're not just trying to all be equal, right? We want to dismantle the systems of power, such as white supremacy, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. And we need these approaches because we want to end rape culture in our society, in our institutions, and within ourselves in our intimate relationships. So Amanda Marcote's piece, I hope you found this really interesting because all these waves of anti-feminism are backlashes to waves of feminism. And so you have the first wave of anti-feminism that really started in the 1970s. That was a backlash to the second wave feminism, women's liberation movement. And here you have your basic argument of the anti-feminists that, men and women are fundamentally different because God said so. And that it's just natural for women to be subordinate to men because that's natural. And the outcomes of this in this first wave are there are just women who internalize sexism, and they are inherently anti-abortion and anti-feminist. The second wave of anti-feminism really emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, and you have that as a backlash to the third wave feminism. And that basic argument of the second wave, right, is that goals of feminism have been achieved, so we don't really need it anymore. And these goals that folks in the 1980s and 90s were talking about were no-fault divorce, equal pay for equal work, that's getting better, and that increasing representation in politics, legal, and educational spheres. And then we have again this myth that emerged that anybody who's challenging patriarchy and patriarchal structures of power is inherently anti-men, and that's not true. But that's a threat that's used by anti-feminists to sort of shut women down, and men as well, from actually advocating feminism. Some really important outcomes of the second wave of anti-feminism is that really this legal framework and these cultural beliefs make it really difficult to prosecute rape. And they reproduce myths in mass media about rape. And so you have victim blaming, you have women being told that it's their fault, primarily, and that also a big myth about rape that started in the 1980s and 1990s that I would argue continues today is that rape is just a bad sexual experience that women regret. And again, that is a myth. That is not true. So that's very significant. We'll continue to discuss sort of more in depth about sexual and gender violence in Unit 4, and think about this and you can come back to this lecture then. And so you have the third wave of anti-feminism, which really kind of emerged in the 2000s when you all were very little. I'm guessing you were born in the late 1990s. And so the basic argument of this third wave of anti-feminism is that, yeah, the 19th Amendment was good. All women should have the right to vote. But challenging this patriarchy thing is just weird, and it's not a socio-political system, so it's unnecessary and wrong. And so the outcomes are pretty significant as we continue on to today in 2019, because there's a lot of anti-abortion positions, and folks have been eroding away at Roe v. Wade through state and local access to abortion. Abstinence only in sex ed, that is an outcome of many anti-feminists and folks who adhere to the gender binary very strictly, who think that there are only men and women in this world, and that other folks either do not exist or are confused, and we know that that's not true. And then also I think this other really big outcome that we continue to see, and a lot of folks like Peggy Ornstein have written about, is that women are always being faulted for having sex, particularly with men outside of heterosexual relationships that are not marriage, but that heterosexual men can have sex with anyone they want. And so on the right here, I put some things because I wanted you to understand overall what Amanda Marcote's piece is trying to do. She's trying to help you understand that the values of anti-feminism are individualism, consumerism, and anti-activism. So if you went to Google and you put in anti-feminist and you did an image search, you would see these patterns. You would see that it's very individual. It's very much about, oh, as long as women can participate in the marketplace like a man, we're free and we're fine. Everything's okay. If it's not bothering me, it's none of my business. I don't care. So there's this really anti-activism sentiment, or that activism isn't needed, which is really contrary to feminism, because feminism is the collective struggle to end sexist oppression, but anti-feminists don't think that collective struggle is needed at all, and they're very much concerned just about themselves. So overall, what does feminism do? Why is it important? It does all of these things, right? You have accurate vocabulary that's evidence-based because we want to end sexism. We want to unlearn it and we want to prevent it. And that we need multiple approaches to do this. And also it challenges the myths of feminism and rape culture. And it provides a theoretical framework and multiple approaches to collectively end sexist oppression. So you should pull out your rape culture pyramid or check it out on ReggieNet again, because this PowerPoint should help make some connections as to what rape culture is and why in particular this class and all of the WGS classes are trying to dismantle and end rape culture. So overall, what are these articles trying to tell you? Right? Bell Hooks, Feminist Politics, Where We Stand, and Amanda Marcote's piece. They're trying to tell you that sexism is the problem and not feminism, that we need multiple approaches to end sexism and prevent it. And we can't just change individuals, we need to change institutions. So all human beings can use and advocate feminism to, again, smash the patriarchy, because our world needs to be more equitable and just, and that actually anti-feminism perpetuates and reinforces sexism and patriarchy as a socio-political system.